I have a confession to make before we start. I chose the title of this paper, Adam Ant once said it, ridicule is nothing to be scared of, as an excuse to walk up to the lectern with the intro to the song Prince Charming playing. It was a total fantasy. I've been dreaming about this moment for a long time. In my head, it works like this. I get introduced, and then the song plays, and I walk up to the lectern. In my head, the walk to the lectern was a little bit further. And then I say something like this. I question now, as I stand here with your desiring expectations of a thrilling and insightful paper on ridicule and its relation to contemporary performance practices, if there is something in the intro to this song. If Ant's wailing laughter somehow might be useful in the context of performance, or at least in my paper presentation now. If his ridiculous laughter might put me at ease. If I somehow find comfort in this artificial recorded laughter. Comfort in that if my performance fails, if I fail to provide an insightful account, or if I slip on a banana skin or a used condom or some blood or something on the way to the lectern, this is all that might happen. Just like Ant, you might just laugh. Might we be able to conceive of Ant's laughter in this context as a rehearsal for the possible failure of my own performance this evening? It might, in fact, all go wrong. Am I really loud? Is that okay? Cool. Peggy Phelan, in her much celebrated book, Unmarked, sees performance as continually failing. I think she's referring to the ephemerality of performance, its liveness, which to a certain degree is always open to chance. Something could always go wrong in a performance. I could have a heart attack and keel over. The speakers could blow up. That's what I like about performance. I like that something might go wrong. I often hope to evoke the sensation that something might go wrong in my own performances. Peggy says, and I quote, "Performance becomes itself through disappearance," end quote. She is talking about performance in relation to other art forms, which she suggests are considered more economically valuable because they can be, for example, bought and hung on your drawing room wall. Peggy continues, "It begins with the knowledge of its own failure, that it cannot be achieved," end quote. Peggy goes on to consider performance as a rehearsal for the other's death. I think what she's saying is that performance is like death in that it is not repeatable. You can't repeat death. Of course, we could repeat performance. I could give this paper tomorrow somewhere else, but that would only mark its difference in space and time. From this perspective, performance in its inevitable failure to become stable, fixed, and therefore valuable as traditionally prescribed, already sets itself up to be ridiculed. Perhaps the most ridiculous thing to do with performance is to write about it, to try to instill what is forever fleeting. Those of us with a certain penchant for the ridiculous, the silly, and the absurd might, in fact, attempt such a thing. That is perhaps what moves us to write and think about performance. It is the ridiculousness of performance and of writing about it that interests me. I want to go back to Ant's ridiculous laughter, though, which sounds so much like its opposite. Is he actually laughing, or is he screaming in agony? But that's exactly it. Laughter is a paradox in that it is both pleasurable but can also be extremely violent. The difference between laughing at somebody and laughing with somebody marks for me what I needed to rehearse today in the form of my musical introduction. The possibility of being ridiculed is always at stake in performance, and is a powerful expression that many artists working in the realm of live art and club performance explore and utilise. Long before Lee Bowery's costume interventions, we had the likes of Blue Lips, Hot Peaches, and the Ridiculous Theatrical Company in New York. The theatre of the ridiculous movement emerged in the 60s New York performance scene. It made a break with the dominant trends in theatre of naturalistic acting and realistic settings. It frequently made a conscious effort at being shocking or disturbing. Ridiculous theatre brought some elements of queer, camp performance to avant-garde theatre. Cross-gender casting was common, with players often recruited from non-professional sources, such as drag queens and other street stars. The scenario used in ridiculous plays were often parodies or reworkings of pop culture fiction, used as vehicles for social commentary or humour. Improvisation played a large role in the often chaotic, ridiculous productions, where the script was treated as just a starting point. We might go back even further in time, though, to examples of theatre of the absurd and even the Dada movement in locating where the ridiculous was manifested in live performance. Dada was anti-art. Its purpose was to ridicule what its participants considered to be the meaninglessness of the modern world. In addition to being anti-war, Dada was also anti-bourgeois and anarchistic in nature. Live artists and club artists today are still heavily invested in the ridiculous, which still has political potential to communicate ideas and feelings, but perhaps more importantly, to celebrate the pleasures the ridiculous stimulate. So there is something both pleasurable and violent about laughter. You could also say I have a particular relationship with violence and humour as someone who grew up as a queer in the valleys of South Wales. Back in the valley, my fascination with Adam Ant apparently started at an early age. Apparently, I would dance in my nappy in front of the TV with a titty for every orifice. I was fascinated by his feathers, fascinated by the way his veiny body jiggled in his spandex, the way his sumptuous outfits were illuminated by theatrical constructs. His songs like Prince Charming, Stand and Deliver, and Dirk Wears White Socks were like mantras, facilitating my desire for the fabulous ridiculous, in the face of a drab and pasty normality. I'm not interested in marking the origins of my queerness, but the effects of it, perhaps. Perhaps the pleasure I found in Ant's lavish setup, which might seem ridiculous in the face of reason and 1980s politics, was already political in its move towards celebrating difference. Ant represented that difference to me, at least. I'd like to note here that my stories are often drawn to exaggeration, but trust me, it's all for valuable effect. I do want to draw a link between the ridiculous and queer subjectivities now, who suffer the violence of ridicule set against heteronormativity. But as Judith Butler points out, I quote, "Acting out of line with heterosexual norms brings with it ostracism, punishment, and violence, not to mention the transgressive pleasures produced by those very prohibitions," end quote. The pleasures of sexual promiscuity and gender bending are often equated with the ridiculous and celebrated in many live art and club performance practices. We may in fact experience performance this evening that engage with ridicule through these means. Artists who engage with the ridiculous today in their practices don't set out to explore the ridiculous necessarily. The ridiculous emerges often from chance or in the collision of the artificial theatrical setup and the real living bodies that occupy it. But what does it mean to perform ridicule? Might the performance of ridicule be an act of recovery, recovering the very thing that represents its failure? In the same way that through an act of recovery, the term queer, that was once used as a homophobic slur, is now uttered as an affirmative when in the hands of the beholder. Perhaps to perform the ridiculous is to re-perform the violence we are subjected to in the face of a boring, pale normativity. The same way that to reclaim the term queer recovers the violence it once represented. The most interesting thing about club performance for me is that it has the ability to commit an act of pleasure, for pleasure's sake, in the face of value that seems to attain to no moral or ethical procedure, and render only useless and unproductive. When performance fails to take itself seriously, it does this brilliantly. When performance is committed to the pleasure it produces, whether those are libidinal, humorous, shocking pleasures through lavish aesthetics and chance, or when a performer can laugh at herself, as Charles Ludlam, founder of the 1960s New York Ridiculous Theatrical Company, says in his manifesto. You are a living mockery of your own ideals. If not, you have set your ideals too low. Ludlam, in his manifesto, gives precedence to the non-serious, reclaiming value in what is normally excluded as superfluous and even ridiculous. From the pleasures of laughing with and the horror of being laughed at, it is perhaps the ability to laugh at oneself that resonates most. There is something both admirable and political in taking the piss of one's own ideas. When performance tries to be over-political, it loses something for me. It loses guts. The real politics are in the guts that ache so much from laughing, or in the guts that ache in fear of ridicule. These are the feelings that move us as performance and audiences, and it's a very addictive sensation, maybe. It always takes guts to make a spectacle of oneself, to communicate one's ideas and stand up for one's beliefs. So Adam Ant might be right in saying stand and deliver, but perhaps his idea that ridicule is nothing to be scared of is actually debilitating to performance, because it is the gut feeling evoked by the prospect of ridicule that perhaps fuels those of us engaged with live performance to keep doing it. And if we fail, to make sure we do so in the most ridiculous way possible.